gatherings. So just to give you a little background, my name's Lisa Levinson, and I host these vegan spirituality online gatherings. And the purpose is to explore veganism as a spiritual practice. And we do this by gathering together and having speakers such as our speaker today, Rabbi Aaron Levy, and we invite people who are leaders in the vegan spiritual movement to talk about their experience and their journey, and we can all learn from each other. And this happens in conjunction with different groups that are going on in person across the country. So we do have groups that meet in different states, primarily in the United States, but we are open to groups starting outside the country as well. And these groups, they generally will have a potluck, have a discussion, maybe do a reading. All of the groups really are designed to explore veganism as a spiritual practice through different means. And so if you're curious to find out if there's a group near you, you can check our website, which is veganspirituality.com. And you can also tune into our conversations on Facebook, which are at Vegan Spirituality Community. So for those of you who are used to our monthly broadcasts, we usually have author of The Peace to All Beings, Judy Carmen, with us, and she's not able to join us tonight, so I'm taking over, and it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce you to our featured speaker today. So I wanted to let you know that Rabbi Aaron Levy, who you can probably see in the background there, is a leader in the revival of downtown Jewish life in Toronto, where he is the founding and executive director of Makom, Creative Downtown Judaism, which is a diverse grassroots community fusing Jewish tradition and progressive values through spirituality, learning, and culture since 2009. Makom creates inclusive space that inspires diverse participants to explore together how Judaism can meaningfully enrich their lives. Ordained in 2004 in the first graduating class of Yeshivat. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeshivat Chovevei Torah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. The Open Orthodox Rabbinical School, Rabbi Levy is also an avid drummer, cyclist, hiker, and vegan. So that's why we're super excited to have you on as our guest today. So we have a few questions for you, but before, I just wanted you to say hello to our guests.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be talking with you tonight.
Yeah. Really a treat. This is a first for us, I will let you know, to have a vegan rabbi who's also leading a vegan synagogue where everybody in the synagogue is signed on to doing some of these activities with plant-based forums. So here we go. I'm curious, Rabbi Levy, or I will call you Rabbi Aaron, if that's okay. How did you become aware of veganism, and what convinced you to go vegan?
Great question. So I'm going to backtrack actually to a little bit earlier in my life, because that's part of the path of how I became vegan. I didn't grow up traditionally Jewishly, religiously observant, so I didn't grow up keeping kosher. When I was in high school, I decided to start trying to keep kosher, sort of as an experiment, because I was interested in exploring Judaism further. And in the process of doing that, I found it made me much more aware of what I was eating and what I wasn't eating. I had to think more about, things before I would just eat them. And the process of that not only made me more conscious of what I was eating, but also really opened my eyes to the idea that I have the power to decide not to eat certain things. And at the time, that was based on traditional laws of kashrut, of keeping kosher. But I'd say that message for myself and that discipline was one that then, not so surprisingly for me, 2 years later, led me to become vegetarian. And in my mind, it's sort of a direct path that I followed from starting to keep kosher to becoming vegetarian. And for about, 13 years, I was an ovo-lacto vegetarian. And in the last few years that I was vegetarian, I started becoming more aware of animal welfare issues around dairy and eggs. And at a certain point felt that I couldn't in good conscience eat dairy or egg products any longer. And so about 12 or so years ago, I became a vegan. So for me, while my motivation for becoming vegetarian and then vegan was not primarily based in Judaism or spirituality, it's in many ways I see it as an outgrowth of my increasing Jewish observance. It was primarily motivated, like most people who become vegetarians or vegans, by concerns for the ethics of how animals are treated both in their lives and in their deaths, and for environmental concerns. But that said, aside from being the initial impetus for thinking more about what I eat, what I don't eat, I'd say that Judaism provided a sort of third source of inspiration for me in becoming vegetarian and then vegan, which maybe we'll get into a little bit over the course of this talk. But it definitely plays I'd say, a sort of significant third role in terms of reinforcing my decision to be a vegan.
Wow. Now that is very interesting, just to hear how you came upon it. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more. So I'm going to go on to the second question here. So did becoming vegan seem to fit with your Judaism and your spiritual journey?
Absolutely. While traditional Jewish practice does not require vegetarianism or veganism, I think it's not only compatible with it, but I think actually a plant-based diet is really the ideal form of diet envisioned in Judaism. And the primary source for that is if you look in the Torah, in the Jewish Bible, at Genesis, in Breshit, the creation story, in the very first chapter of it, when God creates the first human, humans, they are told, you are to eat from every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, every tree that has seed-bearing fruit, they shall be yours for food. And those same plants are given to the animals to eat. And there's no mention of humans eating animals. And in fact, a lot of the traditional commentators say that what's implied by this is that, in fact, originally humans, according to the biblical tradition, were not allowed to eat animals, that the original humans were intended to be vegan. I mean, medieval commentators don't use the term vegan, but you get the idea. While, then 8 chapters later in Genesis, in chapter 9, after the flood, God gives permission to Noah and his family and their later descendants to eat animals. Some of the commentators talk about that as really being a divine concession to human weakness. It's not the ideal. And whether it was because humans had shown themselves to be violent and bloodthirsty in the intervening generations between Genesis, the creation, and Noah 10 generations later, or whether it's because after the flood there was no vegetation left on the earth and people needed to eat something, or whether it was because humans saved at least land-based animal life and therefore perhaps were owed their lives to the humans. Anyway, there's a number of different commentaries that give different reasons, but they all see it as really a stepping down from the original ideal situation laid out in the Garden of Eden when humans were vegan. And then I think sort of on the flip side of things, when you look, for example, at the prophet Isaiah's vision of the Messianic era, the world as it ideally would be in the future when there will be peace and plenty for everyone, he he talks about the lion and the lamb lying down together and a child leading them, and that no one will be afraid on God's holy mountain. And so there are definitely commentaries that understand that image as one where the reason none of the animals or human are afraid of each other is because everything reverts back to the Edenic paradise of both humans and animals all being vegan.
Wow. I haven't heard such a detailed description of this. This is really interesting to me. I also grew up Jewish, so it's really cool to hear this new interpretation. New to me, though.
It's actually new to you, but actually very old.
Yeah.
Thousands of years old, in fact.
Wow. Well, I'm happy to hear that, actually. I really am. So, let's see. Also curious, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about Makom, the creative downtown Judaism, what are some of your projects and what is the website?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll do the last thing first because that's quick. So if anybody is curious to check us out, Makom's website is makomto.org, so makomto.org. Makom in Hebrew means place or space, and we chose that name because what Makom is about is revitalizing downtown Jewish life in Toronto. We're based in the neighborhood where pretty much all Jews who were in Toronto in the early 20th century lived, the neighborhood in and around Kensington Market. For those of you who don't have so much of the Toronto, Canada frame of reference, but maybe New York is a more familiar place, think of like the Lower East Side, but transplanted into Canada. So, it was the immigrant receiving area in the early 1900s, and you had a lot of Jewish immigrants here. And this neighborhood was really the hub of Jewish life for the first half of the 20th century. Then over time, Jews tended to migrate to more suburban areas. But in the past 20 or so years, there's really been a resurgence of Jews living downtown. And Makom is about revitalizing Jewish life. So there are diverse and creative options for downtown Jews to engage in Judaism in ways that really bring together the diversity of downtown Jews and non-Jews who are interested, whether they're partners of Jews or whether they're just curious to check out what we're doing. So we focus on spirituality, learning, and culture, as Lisa mentioned in my little bio at the beginning. In terms of spirituality, we have bi-weekly, really joyous and song-filled Friday night services, and we have services sometimes on Saturday mornings and for all the holidays, including the high holidays. Once a month, our services are followed by a vegan Shabbat dinner, and that's been something that we've been doing for a little over the past year. We'll talk a bit more about that later, I think. We also have a weekly Jewish meditation group. We do family programming. We do adult education. We run a Hebrew immersion after-school program for kids in 3 different locations downtown, and we have a 4th location for preteens. We host an art gallery actually in our space and in the window that fronts onto the street that we're located on. We sometimes hold concerts. So we really try to provide a great diversity of program in order to meet the interests of the real diversity of downtown Jews, both in terms of what their interests might be, and also in terms of the different demographics and identities that people come from, whether they're more religiously liberal or more religiously traditional, or those who would describe themselves as adamantly secular Jews, Sephardic and Ashkenazic, for those who are not familiar with those terms, meaning whether their ancestors come more from like the Middle East or from the Mediterranean or from Central or Eastern Europe. So sort of different cultures of Jews, Jews who are gay and straight and trans and genderqueer, and folks of all ages, from babies to young adults to young families to seniors. So it's a really inclusive community.
It sounds lovely. And I know if I was in Toronto, I would definitely participate in this community. It's amazing. I like that you have a vegan fare at a lot of the regular events that go on. So how would you describe veganism as woven into your events and projects?
Sure. In a formal way, this began a little over a year ago when Makom received a Synagogue Vegan Challenge grant from the Shamayim V'Aretz Institute, which is a Jewish animal welfare organization based in the U.S., and Veg Fund, which is a secular vegan promoting organization also based in the States. And so this past fall, the two of them teamed up to launch this Synagogue Vegan Challenge with the idea of asking synagogues to apply for the grant if they pledged to go vegan for the year, and then this grant would help to cover some of the costs of vegan food over the course of the year. So Makom was actually already vegetarian in all of our programming prior to that point. Between my own personal bias as someone who's a vegan, and therefore, it'd be great if Makom were to be vegan, and the fact that, as a grassroots community, we can always use some more funding. It made sense for us to apply for this grant, and we were thankful to be awarded it. And so from the time that the grant started for us last September, Makom has been entirely vegan in all of our programming. That's been showcased most significantly at our monthly Shabbat or Friday night dinners, where we've been serving only vegan food, but also any of our other programs or meetings or classes or different things going on, whether it's just snacks or light food or whatever we're serving, has been all vegan. And then actually just last month at a board meeting, the board of Makom voted that even though the Synagogue Vegan Challenge grant had concluded that Makom would remain vegan going forward. I was very happy and actually, to be honest, surprised by that decision because, I'm the executive director of Makom and its rabbi, but I'm not a board member, and none of the board members is a vegan. There is one vegetarian among them, but the rest are, omnivores. And so I thought it was great that they decided to vote that Makom should stay vegan going forward.
Wow, I have to say, mazel tov for that. That is so exciting. How wonderful. Be supported, especially, like you said, that is mixed in terms of their personal choices. So that is really astounding that they supported this decision and actually went ahead with it. I'm very impressed. Yeah, I know.
And I think, by the way, that's, sorry, just to jump in for a sec, I think that's a testament to the fact that this past year, the sort of, the grant year of it, when we were committed to it, and even maybe those who ideologically weren't so into it, but were motivated by like, hey, it'll help, help us balance the books and help us fund having regular Shabbat dinners more frequently than we had in the past. I think because the year went really well and people responded very positively to the food and the experiences, that was what convinced the board members that we should stick with it. And also, one of the board members, who is an omnivore himself, said, what, if we were to go back now, it would seem like taking a step backwards. Like once we've gone to this higher level, we shouldn't, go back down. So I thought that was a really nice sentiment to hear from someone.
I am very impressed, and I think that shows that this vegan challenge really is doing something. And I know that this is a part of Rabbi Shmuley, who we've interviewed on our show before. This is part of their initiative to encourage other synagogues to embrace veganism as a part of their spiritual practice. So that's really, really exciting. I can remember at a synagogue in Philadelphia that I really enjoyed. It was very progressive. And I sat down with the rabbi after one of the meals. I think it was after Yom Kippur, and just said, I didn't really feel as welcome because I'm vegan and there wasn't anything for me to eat at the break the fast. So, but that was really positive because she actually didn't think about that because it wasn't part of her world. And just knowing about that, she was open to having like vegan options at that break the fast. So I think for many of us, just speaking our truth and sharing what we need can be important. So I also am wondering how is Makom, how is it being received by less progressive folks?
Just to clarify, do you mean in general or the fact that Makom is vegan?
I think let's go for both of those.
Okay. Well, especially because Makom is in downtown Toronto, which is not really where the center of Jewish life is any longer. Downtown Jewish life is, generally speaking, much more open and, let's say, cooperative than in a lot of other parts of Toronto, where maybe there's more territoriality or denominational politics. Downtown, there's only a handful of Jewish, communities or synagogues or independent, minyanim, prayer communities. And I think we all have a really positive collegial relationship with each other. Whether it's me and I'm an Orthodox rabbi, or my colleagues who are Reform or Reconstructionist or Jewish humanist, or lots of different folks kind of across the map, and we all have really good positive relations with each other. So within the downtown scene, no one is really challenging me or Makom for being a really inclusive and accepting community, and one that does things that are really kind of a quirky blend of traditional and progressive practices. So, for example, like our prayer services, which are quite traditional in certain respects, in that we do all of the traditional prayers in Hebrew. We have 3 seating sections for all the services. So we have the traditional setup of separate men's and women's seating, and we also have a mixed seating section. So that way folks can choose where they want to sit depending on their own comfort level, or if they're, gender non-binary, then they don't have to feel that they have to, make a choice in terms of sitting in just the men's or women's section. So I think the kind of just success that Makom has had over the, coming up on 10 years that we've been around, in connecting with lots of folks of all stripes and flavors, really just has been received very positively. And, no one says like, well, why do you have this section, or why do you have that section? I only want, my section or something. Because people get that the idea of Makom is creating a space where lots of diverse folks can come together. In terms of veganism, I was expecting much more pushback in the past year. Like at Shabbat dinners, that people would say like, why aren't we having dairy? Or no one really says, why aren't we having like chicken soup or anything? Because Makom has already been already been vegetarian for the entire life of the organization. And within Makom, there are so many vegetarians and more than a handful of vegans as well. So we really didn't get any strong pushback. A few people asked about why we don't have challah, traditional braided Ashkenazic egg bread for Shabbat dinners. And aside from pointing out that actually one doesn't need challah in order to have a fully traditional Shabbat dinner, and in fact, Sephardic Jews from the Mediterranean Middle East, don't use challah. It's really just a Central and Eastern European custom, and we're using pita, which is sort of what you find is the norm more in the Middle East and Jewish communities as well for Shabbat dinners. None of the kosher bakeries in Toronto make a vegan challah. And so, as I've said to folks, if you want to come in to Makom and spend, part of your Thursday or Friday baking a bunch of vegan chalot, we would be glad to have challah at Shabbat dinner. But because none of the bakeries that are kosher carry that, that's why we're having pita. So that's, one of the very light points of objection I received over the past year, but no one who was like actually upset. Or felt alienated because of it.
That really is an interesting mild criticism, I guess, but it also gives you an opportunity to educate people about some of the other traditions, like you mentioned, the Sephardic tradition, which I just learned about from this interview today, which I think is interesting. It kind of widens our cultural perspective. So, and have you also had to deal with any criticisms of veganism just personally? I'm curious how you respond to those.
Not for quite a while, but I know that at earlier points in my life, both as a vegetarian and as a vegan, I would sometimes get criticized, particularly in more traditionally observant Jewish circles, like in Orthodox circles, for not eating meat. And people would often kind of, in an offhand way, cite the idea that comes from the Talmud, Ein simcha el b'vasar v'yayin, which in Hebrew means there is no joy except with meat and wine. And people sort of use that idea to say, because on Shabbat and holidays you're supposed to be joyous, therefore you must have meat and wine on Shabbat. So how could I, as a vegetarian or later as a vegan, be abstaining from meat? And isn't that then sort of diminishing the sanctity or the joy of keeping Shabbat or the holidays? And so whenever people would raise that, which wasn't like all the time, but was with some frequency, I'd point out that that's actually not the entirety of that text in the Talmud, but actually that piece in the Talmud says that originally there was no joy except with meat and with wine, but now since the destruction of the temple, which is referring to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem that stood there until 70 CE when it was destroyed by the Romans. So since the destruction of the temple, the joy for Shabbat and holidays is with wine, because the meat that it was referring to was sacrificial meat from when there was actually animal sacrifice happening in the temple. And so the joy it was talking about was about the act of sacrifice and then partaking in the sacrifice and such. That Talmudic text is actually not talking about just like eating meat at one's regular table or anything. So I had an easy rejoinder to people when they would offer me that criticism by just, keying them into the full context of that piece of Talmud.
Well, that's quite a response. I'm sure that would open people's eyes. Very interesting. I haven't even heard that. So very, very interesting. I think that's something that has caused many vegan and vegetarian Jewish people to kind of think about that history of the animal sacrifice. So,
yeah, just actually, since we're talking about animal sacrifice for a sec, I'll mention, because then, some people will say, well, if Judaism idealizes vegetarianism or veganism, then why does the Torah have lots of sacrifices that are commanded in it? And it doesn't seem to be presented as a less than ideal scenario if it's saying like on these holidays bring these animals to sacrifice. So in addition to the fact that there are vegetarian and actually vegan sacrifices that are also mentioned in the Torah, like grain sacrifices and olive oil and wine, things like that. But yes, there are a lot of animal sacrifices. But Maimonides, Rabbi Moses, the son of Maimon, who was a 12th century rabbi, physician, and philosopher, considered one of the leading intellectuals of Jewish history, in his commentary, his philosophic work, Guide for the Perplexed, he talks about how the sacrifices were really just a stepping stone to wean the ancient Israelites away from paganism. And so it would have been too radical a shift to go from the worship of multiple gods through sacrifice to the worship of only one God for the entire universe with nothing tangible like sacrifice. So instead, the Torah is doing it step by step and sort of first weaning people off of polytheism to monotheism, but keeping the idea of physical animal sacrifice intact. And then Maimonides says, but then we sort of move to a higher stage by no longer doing animal sacrifice, but rather just having verbal prayer and contemplation and meditation. So that's not certainly the only perspective on sacrifices. As with anything in Judaism, there's always more than one opinion, more than one perspective. But that's an approach that I find compelling.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's interesting. And for those of us who have Jewish history or background, it would be good to look into that about Maimonides. I also, just because I attended some Caparot protests in Los Angeles, where I'm living right now, and we did a compassionate Caparot here as a way to provide some education and then coupled that with a protest. So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure.
And
so just
maybe you two also might want to explain it for people who might.
Yeah, I was going to start with that. Okay, so Lisa is referring to kaparot, which is a custom, not a Jewish law, but just a custom that some Jewish communities have of the idea of in the lead up to the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, this sort of symbolic transference of one's sins, one's misdeeds, missing the mark from the past year onto something, and then giving that something to charity, with the idea that it's a way of sort of doing something physical to embody the idea of starting with a clean slate and sort of a clean, new, pure start for the new year. And the two different methods that are often used for kaparot are either the, let's say, humane method, but which is certainly attested in traditional sources, which is to basically take some amount of money and to move it around over one's head or over the head of one's kids, and say, all of my sins are being transferred to this money, and then to give that money to tzedakah, to charity. So that's one method. The other method is to hold a live chicken and to move it around over one's head with the idea of symbolically transferring one's misdeeds from the past year to it. And then the animal not ideally, but within this scenario would then be slaughtered and then the meat given to those who are hungry. So it's this latter animal using practice that Lisa's talking about. It's become, particularly in modern urban environments, a very cruel practice because even beyond the slaughter of an animal, but the way it ends up playing out nowadays is that you'll have crates that are stuffed with chickens, and they're out at some synagogue or somewhere where this ritual is taking place, and rather than holding the animal, cradling it, instead sometimes people, especially those who are not familiar with chickens and how they are supposed to be handled, will hold them by their feet or by their wings and really swing them around over their heads, thus really hurting the animals and causing suffering to them, which, by the way, causing suffering to animals is a violation of a commandment in the Torah called Tsar Ba'alei Chaim, causing suffering to animals. And then in a lot of urban contexts, the animals don't even then get slaughtered and with their meat given to those who are poor and hungry, but because it's been in this kind of urban environment where there haven't necessarily been hygienic controls and stuff, the chickens who are then potentially injured are then just left to die in some scenarios, at least that I've read about. So it's become a particularly cruel and unnecessary practice, and in my mind, the exact opposite of the intention of starting the new year with a positive, clean start, one based in purity and mitzvot, and doing the commandments the way we should be. So that's great, Lisa, that you were part of an action to protest it and to provide the compassionate alternative to it, which is just as traditional.
Thank you for explaining that so clearly, what it was, the ritual, and also how necessary it is. And just for those of us who are faith-based animal activists to know that this isn't necessarily part of all Jewish tradition, especially with the animals, using the animals as part of it. So,
Right. Yeah. Like I don't do kaparot at all because it's not part of, my particular set of customs. And there are plenty of traditionally observant Jews. In fact, I would guess, although I don't have stats on this, I would guess the vast majority of traditionally observant Jews probably do not do kaparot. But even for those Jews who do kaparot, there's no requirement that they do it with an animal. It can be done with money.
yeah, thank you so much for going through that, just in case for those activists who might be starting to associate that protest activity with Judaism and with the holidays there. I actually, many of me and also many of my Jewish friends never heard of that holiday growing up, so I think it's an interesting one to learn about later. So I have a couple of other questions, and just one of them is related to activism, because one of the goals of vegan spirituality is to provide spiritual support for vegan activists who struggle with grief and burnout because of constantly being aware of these sorts of brutality like the one that we just discussed. So what advice would you have for us to cope with that, and how to find the strength that we need to continue our work?
I would say that community is certainly important. So whether it's a vegan community or one's own religious community or other communities that one's a part of, hopefully that's something that feels supportive and positive in your life in general. And therefore, even if you feel like it's an extremely uphill battle to try to reduce animal suffering in the world, at least you feel that you have supportive people around you in one way or another. Obviously, it's great if you're connected with other folks who share similar concerns about animal welfare. But even if not, just having a community in general is certainly really important, and I'd say a religious community in particular. The other thing I would say is to also just to take heart in knowing that what we're doing is important and is positive, and little by little is making a difference in the world. And while it might not seem so when one thinks about the billions of animals that are being killed all the time for human consumption, but if you don't buy an animal or an animal product for a meal, well, that's potentially one more animal that's alive because of you. So thinking about the idea of that we're making a real difference in terms of the lives and deaths of real living creatures in the world. And then finally, I would also just suggest that we also think about the idea that, at least according to Jewish tradition, all creatures have souls. And while a human soul might be different from the soul of a cow or of a turkey, that they are also considered to have souls. And so by not eating animals, we are really allowing their souls to live as well. And that so we're making not just sort of a physical contribution to the world and to the lives of animals, but we're also making a spiritual contribution as well.
Such a beautiful answer. Thank you so much. I think that's going to help many of us to take heart and find some inspiration, really, to continue and find that community that can help us do that. So thank you. That's great. Is there anything else that you might want to add before we open to up for maybe a couple questions?
No, I think that probably covers a lot. I mean, I guess maybe I'll just throw out there that aside from the very few sources that I mentioned within traditional Jewish texts that support vegetarianism and veganism, there are many, many more. So it's really not hard at all to not just justify, but even to, I'd say, elevate a plant-based diet from within traditional Jewish concepts and texts. And it's one that really has very strong support if you go back to the sources.
Excellent. That is good to know. And one of the things that we've put together as part of this effort is connected to In Defense of Animals, and we also have an interfaith vegan coalition that we've started, and we provide these faith-based advocacy kits that are helping people to veganize their place of worship. We have them for different traditions, so for Judaism, for different sects of Christianity, and so that's the type of thing that we've tried to include in these kits, is some of these specific references to the liturgy, so people can say, oh, well, here's actually some information that you can share with your rabbi, or something I think we need to add to our Jewish advocacy kit is about the vegan challenge that you went through with your synagogue, because that would be really a helpful thing for a person who is an activist who does go to a synagogue that maybe hasn't adopted these policies yet. They can say, did you know that there was a vegan challenge? And that might be something they could move towards after trying a few other advocacy ideas first.
It's actually not just that the vegan challenge was, although the first year of it has wrapped up and the first 5 communities that participated in it are no longer in it, Makom included. The Synagogue Vegan Challenge is now on to round 2. And so there are 5 other communities that are now going vegan for the year. So, if this is something that, folks think might fly in their own Jewish communities, you might want to get your rabbi or your board or whatever to apply to be part of it next year.
Yeah, great idea. That is an excellent idea for those people who have been talking with their synagogues and maybe even with the board about their vegan values, and then to bring up here's an actual way to do that. And so as we move into the next portion where people can share and talk, I know Rachel has joined us, and she's from Shamayim V'Aretz, and I would probably need help with the pronunciation of all of that, but she's with us. And so we have a comment and a couple questions. So one of the comments is, what do you find is most effective to convince traditional Orthodox leadership to consider alternative narratives to traditional meat eating regarding the sources? And one other comment is, our student fellows of Shamayim V'Aretz find this challenging?
I would say that 2 things, really. One would be kind of the way one leads one's own life. Like if one can demonstrate that one is a traditionally practicing or observant Jew who is also vegan, that I think in and of itself makes a certain statement, right? It's obviously much harder to tell a community, you should do this, if you're not generally keeping the practices of the community, right? So if it's because the question was about like more traditional and more Orthodox communities. So someone who's, practicing a more liberal form of Judaism isn't really well positioned to be able to tell an Orthodox community what to do or not, right? Because like, why should they listen to you? You're, approaching Judaism in a different way in general. So I think the way one leads one's life is a good and important first step. And then I'd say secondarily, being familiar with sources and being able to present them in a knowledgeable and coherent way that doesn't overread them. One thing I actually find very irksome is when I'll read something saying the Torah requires all Jews to be vegans or something, and like that's really not true. I might wish that were true, but I'd say that the Torah elevates the idea of veganism and holds it up as an ideal, but it doesn't absolutely require it of everyone. And so I think when people overstate the case, they're not actually helping the cause. But that said, there are plenty of sources that really do strongly support the idea of Jews being vegetarian or vegan, and that I think can be used to buttress the main, let's say, more secular contemporary arguments for eating a plant-based diet in terms of the ethics of how animals are treated in their lives and deaths, and the very strong and compelling environmental reasons for ceasing the whole animal agriculture industry. So that's what I would say in terms of talking to folks in more traditional Jewish communities or circles, and I would imagine that's really not going to be so much different whether we're talking about folks in a adult community or in a student organization. That it's more or less going to be the same.
Thank you so much. And actually, Michal is also saying thank you. She's the person who chatted that with us. I also would like to invite anyone who's joined us in the webinar. You're welcome to now turn on your webcam if you do want to ask your question directly. You can also turn on your audio. For those of you who are on the phone, I know we have someone who's joined us on the phone. You can press that *4 button and then ask a question if you'd like. So I just want to hold a little space for that if anyone else wants to ask a question. Check to see, looking at the folks who are joining us. So if anybody wanted, the way to unmute yourself is just to click on the microphone icon. So you can do that if you have a question. And if not, then what I would like to do is take a moment just to thank Rabbi Aaron. This has been really a delight. I think you got into lots of detail about your practice, about Makom and your path to veganism, which is so interesting. And for me, very inspiring to have someone on board you're such an exemplary synagogue for many of us Jews who would love to be in that type of environment. Me included. I think that would be wonderful. And I'm just curious, I know we've got someone joined us with their webcam. Would you like to ask a question or say a word or two? And let's see if we can get her mic on. Just looking to see. You can actually unmute yourself if you'd like. If you'd like to say a word or two, you can do that just by clicking on the. Hi.
Hi. I'll just say thank you. Thank you, Aaron. We're very inspired by the Synagogue Vegan Challenge because these are people who are trailblazers, not only to do with this, but in general about community and perspective. And we're seeing wonderful projects on the ground, and it's cross-generational. I have to add to what Aaron's saying. It's wonderful to see not just younger generations, but people who are very they surprise themselves how open they are to hear about alternatives, and we've been getting a lot of feedback about that. And of course, how you educate the next generations, because it's not just about us. It's about a whole way of looking at life, and how do you deal with the next generations to bring them on board, where compassion is a key word, where they've got a responsibility in their environmental footprint. And so we're very, it's so wonderful to have this community and people like Aaron and the next cohort. And hopefully, we'll be able to have a model for also interfaith communities where there'll be a challenge for diverse communities and how to do it and to have that as a round table shared aim. So it's something to think about with your organization. How can we convene such a challenge and go in for it together for an interfaith project? Just as an idea.
That
Yeah,
is a
exciting.
fabulous idea, taking place
It's
right here on the
exciting.
spot. I love that idea. And can you
Yeah,
share with
absolutely.
others a little bit about, just so people know who you are? Just,
So I'm very new to Shamayim V'Aretz. I've worked in Jewish education for more years than I care to share. I think if you count the circles in a tree, I'll be equivalent to some of the Californian trees. And if I can use a local metaphor. And one of the big things is, how do you teach compassion? When you teach compassion and teach tikkun olam, fixing the world, and one of the greatest ways to do it is by not only working around humans, but a very good way is working with young people about animals, because they're so obviously a group that don't have spokespeople, that cannot express themselves, and there we can really highlight our role as guardians, as caretakers. So it's a wonderful way of doing it as well from an educational point of view. And again, connecting us to other faiths and to ways of teaching compassion. So that's where I come from, and my Judaism and my work. And I'm a student rabbi, so I look forward to going in the footsteps of Rabbi Aaron with what I'm doing with my education now and moving forward, and so grateful to have so much to learn from people like Aaron, etc.
Well, that is wonderful. Thank you for sharing it. For those people who just need a little more connecting of the dots. So Makom took the Vegan Challenge, and the Vegan Challenge was offered by the organization that Michal, who is asking the question, is intimately involved with. She's on the board there, and so this is a really nice synergy to be able to hear about the Vegan Challenge and then get to hear a little bit from a person who's initiated the challenge for other synagogues to take. And we did get a comment I just want to mention from someone who's with us who shared that growing up Catholic, they had learned, sadly, that animals had no souls, and are really glad to hear that this is not part of Jewish tradition, is thankful to Rabbi Aaron for sharing that. And we also have from a pastor, Pastor Rob, who's joined us and actually spoken with us before. He wants to applaud your conviction and dedication and ability to work successfully with a board that's not vegan. Really wanting to share that with you, some praise. So
Thanks.
So this is quite a treat. It's really important that we have these opportunities to discuss what does it mean to be spiritual and be vegan within our communities. And so thanks to everyone who's joined the call to make that happen. And I'm wondering, Aaron, if you wanted to close us out with an intention or blessing prayer of any kind?
Sure. So I'd like to just share a piece of a prayer that's traditionally said as part of the Shabbat and holiday morning service. And I'm going to sing just a couple, it's like a multi-page prayer. We're not going to go through all of that, but I'm going to sing just the first few lines of it, and then I'll translate it. Nishmat kol chai, tevarech et shimcha Adonai Eloheinu, v'ruach kol basar, tefaer dramim zichrecha malkeinu tamid, min haolam ve'ad haolam ata'el, mivaladecha imanu melech, goel u'moshiach, hodel matzil farnes u'rachem, v'chol yitzhara v'tzukah, ein lanu melech ele ata. So in English, the soul of all that lives shall bless your name, eternal our God. and the spirit of all flesh shall always glorify and exalt your remembrance, our ruler. From eternity to eternity, you are God. Without you, we have no ruler, redeemer, or savior who liberates, rescues, sustains, and shows compassion in every time of trouble and distress. And this is one of my favorite prayers, actually, particularly because this idea that not just the people who are literally saying this prayer, but rather the idea that the souls of everything that exists in the world, just their existence, is a praise of God, of the Creator. And because it doesn't say the soul of all people or the soul of all who are praying, but rather Nishmat Kol Chai, the soul of all that lives. And so to me, this feels like a prayer that is really so universal in recognizing how all aspects of creation, by their very existence, are a praise of the wonders of the world and of God.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Aaron. This is very uplifting and inspiring. So I'm so grateful to you for joining us this evening and for sharing your favorite prayer blessing with us. Thanks to everyone who's joined us this evening, and we hope that you'll join us again. This is something we offer every month, and we have different speakers so that we can share together some of our different traditions and explore them together as vegans. So thanks very much. And I think both Rabbi and myself will be at the Parliament of World Religions, which is happening in his fair city of Toronto, and that will be happening November 1st through the 7th of this year. And the Interfaith Vegan Coalition will have a large booth there, and we're actually hosting a vegan banquet for the first time there ever. And so we encourage everyone to find out more about that. You can visit our website, which is interfaithvegancoalition.org, and from there, look under our current projects, and you'll find out about the Parliament of World Religions. So thank you to everybody for joining us, and we hope you have a lovely evening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.